So welcome back to Foresight Paradigm. I am very excited to be speaking with the author Philipp Blom. How are you, sir?
I'm very well. Thanks for inviting me.
Excellent. Well, I'm excited to have you on because the Enlightenment is my favorite period of history. I have a small library about the Enlightenment, and your books in particular, like The Wicked Company, really they kind of like put you in, 18th century France and Europe. Uh, really make those characters come alive, and it makes you want to like time travel there, really, as well as travel now. So I also think the Enlightenment is extremely important for modernity and our modern institutions and values that we have in the Western world. So if you could, Mr. Blum, tell people who don't know, viewers who may not know, what is the Enlightenment?
What is the Enlightenment? You start with this small questions first.
Well, to
Uh,
give a general starting point, just because a lot of people don't know, I've been in the bookstores and I've asked, for example, can I have books on the Enlightenment? And they'll lead me to like a Buddhist section.
yeah,
They think I'm talking about
that's the
Buddhism.
thing, of course. I mean,
So,
first of all, the Enlightenment you and I are talking about is nothing to do with Buddhism, nothing to do
right,
with finding a higher truth through meditation or so. Though, if you look at Sam Harris, you can also do meditation in a non sort of mystical way. But
right,
the Enlightenment we're talking about is specifically really, it's not one thing, frankly. I mean, look, I'm sorry, I'm one of those historians who think that it's the mark of a good historian to always say, well, it's a little bit more complicated than this. Um, the Enlightenment is a whole landscape of debates that began roughly in the 17th century as the influence of the church in Europe began to wane, as the first scientific experiments showed and theories showed traction so that you could actually repeat them and actually explain stuff and predict stuff scientifically. And that pushed back other ways of understanding the world, such as Christianity, such as alchemy, such as magic, etc. And so there was a growing number of thinkers who thought what really would be important is to understand nature not through revelation, not through some holy book, but simply by thinking about it and to understand our own position of nature in nature by thinking about it. So by reason alone and empirical evidence. And that necessarily means that you have to accept that what you know about the world will be incomplete because we don't know everything and reason can't discover everything. It's not a perfect tool. But they said it's the best tool we have. People like Spinoza, Baruch de Spinoza in Amsterdam, people like René Descartes in France, they were among the first who wrote books that simply proposed, let's not take a holy scripture and have that as the main tool of understanding the world, but let's just see what can we discover if we look hard and think well. And I would say that is, in very broad terms, what the Enlightenment is about.
right. Well, people like Jonathan Israel, who's a big Enlightenment scholar, he points to the Radical Enlightenment as the foundation of our modern democratic ideals. For example, racial and sexual equality and eradication of religion from or religious authority from the legislative process and education and full church-state separation, things like that. So would you agree with that?
Well, again, yes, but the Enlightenment, I said, really you should use the word in plural, the Enlightenments, because there were so many traditions in different places. And the French Enlightenment is very different from what people were up to in Scotland or in Germany or in England. So,
Right.
but, and within this landscape, within these different, which was often, of course, also a reaction to historical circumstance, to the society people found themselves in. So
Right.
England, for instance, was religiously relatively tolerant in the later 17th and 18th century, and therefore English Enlightenment thinkers weren't so obsessed with religion and with refuting religion and pushing back religious tyranny. Whereas in France, where people could still be burnt for believing the wrong thing, or at least executed, where they had their lives and their careers destroyed, that was very much a political project, arguing against the church and against Christianity. So
Right.
there were different parts. What I'm most interested in is what several scholars call the Radical Enlightenment, and I want to tell you why, although I'm sort of trying not to overload the debate. But
Oh, it's fine.
the Enlightenment as a sort of catch-all term has a very ambivalent legacy, actually. Because on the one hand, yes, it put forward the idea of human rights, of sexual equality, of democracy, of rationality. But on the other hand, many Enlightenment thinkers were avowed racists. They were fine with slavery. They didn't think women should have particularly equal position in society. For instance, the French Revolution, that was not on the top of the revolutionaries' agenda. But more to the point, and I think philosophically much more importantly, what many Enlighteners did, many of the mainstream Enlighteners, what you call the Deist Enlightenment. And deism is simply the idea that even if God isn't an old man with a white beard sitting on a cloud and sending down thunderbolts, there is a sort of divine principle that informs the world. There is a sort of, there is something to believe in, even if it is not. There is a benevolent, rational force that has created this world. That was the mainstream of the Enlightenment. The radicals, in a moment to them, they didn't buy that. They didn't buy into that. But this deist mainstream of the Enlightenment, they actually took a lot of Christian tropes, Christian arguments, and you can say secularized them, gave them another coat of paint and put another label on them. So, for instance, for the Enlighteners, reason is very important. For Christianity, the soul is very important. Your immortal soul that you have to save. And guess what? They're both the noble immaterial part of your being that you have to strive to free from your grubby material bodily existence. The universalist claim of both Christianity and the Enlightenment, the salvation story of Christianity and the idea of progress in the Enlightenment, many of these things, the idea that we are the masters of creation, that we are here to subjugate the earth, that comes from the Bible, and the idea of the mastery of nature through technology and science that came from the Enlightenment. In many ways, you have got parallels that are very strong and that effectively helped a culture to absorb Christian thinking without still calling it Christian thinking.
Right.
Absorb these ideas unexamined and carry them on. And that, I think, is something that very much needs to be re-examined, and we need to be very much aware of that, happening. But as I say, this was the mainstream deist Enlightenment, the Enlightenment of people like Voltaire, of people like Immanuel Kant.
But don't you think that there were differences between them, but a lot of them were friends and they wrote each other and they sometimes admired each other's work. And they all to different extents had an idea of bettering humanity and the fact that we can through science and reason. I mean, some of the scope like of Voltaire was more limited than say Diderot. He kind of kissed up to the aristocracy a bit, right?
Look, Voltaire
But they
was,
still
sorry.
they still but they still all had a general idea, even if their scope was different or their reach was different, to ameliorate humanity or at least the higher echelons of humanity through reason and science. And I mean, Voltaire was very anti-Christian, and kind of the Christian worldview had been, especially in the Middle Ages, that the world is, a veil of tears, it's fallen. You can only have salvation through, religion, but the Enlightenment kind of challenged that generally, right?
Well, that's true, but Voltaire is a great example. And
Okay.
before we come to the real meat of the conversation and the radical Enlightenment, Voltaire was a fantastic writer, wonderful stylist, wonderful quotes that you can sort of keep for the ages.
Right.
But he was also a great cynic. He was someone who argued for liberty but invested in slavery, in slave ships. Someone who told people in his novel that on every sack of sugar that came from the Caribbean, there was human blood. And yet he
Voltaire
invested,
invested in slavery.
yes, he invested in the
Huh.
company of the West Indies that had slave plantations. And he made
I
a
had
lot
not
of,
read that.
you know,
Huh.
he argued for liberty, but he borrowed money to tyrants because he was extremely rich, and there were a lot of princes about who wanted to have money. He argued against religion, but he thought, you know, for common people, it's better if they believe in God because otherwise they wouldn't be very moral.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so, you
Kind of
know,
like Thomas
that sort of
Jefferson. It kind of
shows whole duality of enlightenment and practice. And he was,
right.
you know, he was frankly, in many ways, a cynic. Um, Again, a wonderful writer, absolutely worth reading, but you know, you mustn't always take people only by their written word.
Right.
And you know, he was a very important figure. He also fought some very important fights, but you know, he believed there's a wonderful story that he himself writes about the cook of the Sultan. That was back then. There was a great sort of fashion for Orientalism, and so you know, because it was far away from people's own societies, sultans or you know, so-called Oriental exotic societies were frequently
Right.
taken as a sort of mirror of one's own society. And he says, you know, there's the Sultan, he's got a cook. And then he says the cook comes when he basically gives Shylock's speech from The Merchant in Venice. And he says, you know, don't I bleed in the same way as you if you cut me? And
Right.
don't I to eat? And don't I want liberty? And all these things. And the answer is, and perhaps in some future you may do, but as long as the Sultan is still the Sultan, you should stay the cook.
Right.
And, you
Yeah.
know,
Well,
so Voltaire,
Voltaire at least argued for toleration, and there was the callous incident.
yes,
Um, yeah.
that
So
that
yeah.
Voltaire at his really noblest. Mind you,
Right.
he was also in a position to be noble because he was already exiled.
Right.
Very characteristically, not because he had made a very courageous stance on principle, but because he had annoyed an aristocrat with a cheeky poem about the aristocrat being a cuckold. And
Right.
so he had to leave France. But he lived just across the border, and he loved publishing books and sort of stirring up things a bit. But with the Calas incident, who was a Protestant in Catholic France, and Protestants were really persecuted at that time in France.
Right.
And well, to cut a long story short, he was brought to trial on trump drop charges and was executed. And Voltaire wrote very movingly about that and very strongly about that. But what I want to say, I mean, first of all, we are all caught up in our historic circumstances, and none of us are as noble as our ideas want us to make us out.
Right.
But for some people, that was a little more true than for others. It's
Right.
interesting that Voltaire's relationship to the radical enlighteners in Paris was
Right.
always very testy. They
Right.
didn't like each other very much. They didn't trust each other very much. And they basically did a lot to stay out of each other's way.
Right.
Um, and then we get to what interested me most, which is because, well, sorry, another quick digression because I think this is very important. When
Sure.
we
Sure.
look back at the Enlightenment, we look back at it through history books. Nobody has the lifetime to go to all the original source documents without the mediation of some guiding material.
Right.
Uh, and so what we see first of the past is always what other historians tell us. And so our image of the Enlightenment was very strongly drawn and dominated by 19th century historians, 19th and early 20th century historians who privileged one kind of Enlightenment and who marginalized another one. Didn't write about it or said, oh, these figures are not very important. They had nothing original and important to say. There's no need to read them. And those are the guys that I'm particularly interested in.
Me too, actually.
Yes,
People like Diderot and de Holbach are intellectual heroes of mine, and
and
I in some of my books on the Enlightenment, the Holbach is virtually absent, which is
Well, this is, he is a perfect, both of them are perfect. I mean, Thierry d'Holbach, who was a French, he was basically a rich amateur, I mean, a rich gentleman. His
right.
uncle made an awful lot of money through speculation, and d'Holbach never worked for his money. He was a lawyer by trade, but never had to do that job. And he had simply a lot of money. But he used the money very well by supporting people, by supporting writers, by supporting artists, by getting together a salon, which was twice or three times a week, and where people could meet and discuss freely, because don't forget, this was a society with very strong censorship. So you couldn't publish what you wanted to say, and there were police spies all over the place. You couldn't in public even say what you wanted to say. So these things retreated to private salons where you were by invitation only and where you could actually speak your mind. And Holbach ran one of these salons, but he was also one of the most important best-selling authors of the 18th century, which until very recently wasn't known at all.
Right.
Because he always wrote under pseudonyms. And he then, for instance, had his manuscript, first of all, copied out by someone he trusted, so that if the manuscript was intercepted, nobody could recognize his handwriting. And then it was smuggled from Paris to Amsterdam, where the book was printed. And then from Amsterdam, the books were smuggled back into France and sold really like drugs, like sort of under shady characters under bridges. This
really kind of common when you think about it today, but yeah,
this was dangerous stuff.
Yeah.
And d'Holbach, I mean, some of his books, especially one called The System of Nature, sold. I mean, it was a huge bestseller by the standards of its time.
And I actually own The System of Nature myself. I have Good Sense. I have Christianity Unveiled. I have a lot of Diderot's works. And the Holbach definitely, his salon was kind of the center of intellectual activity in Europe really for decades. I mean, you had like David Hume went there, and Cesare Beccaria, who wrote on Crime and Punishment. Benjamin Franklin went there. Thomas Jefferson owned books of his in his library, but as you point out in your book, he got there too late to really see that scene when he was ambassador in Paris for America. But before we get into the Radical Enlightenment, and that'll kind of be just focused on only the Radical Enlightenment from here forward, I wanted to ask you, in your book, you kind of completely the French Revolution. You don't have a good opinion of it at all. Like you think it seems to be you kind of paint it in an entirely bad light. But when I read a lot of the information, like because so basically pretty much all of the Radical Enlightenment globally, they detested Robespierre and the Terror as a complete perversion of the Enlightenment. He introduced, basically authoritarian populism, and he replaced the rights of man. But when we had the rights of man in 1789, Condorcet was a disciple of Diderot and de Holbach, and that was really how it started.
Every revolution is started by idealists and ended by gangsters.
Yeah.
And that's very much the case for the French Revolution.
It ended in Napoleon, basically, kind of, when he took over, right?
Well, Napoleon is a sort of complete one-off, and very difficult figure to understand and to evaluate properly. But when you get to the likes of Robespierre and of Saint-Just and perhaps also Marat, then you've got really people who were, like Lenin, prepared to cover the world in corpses just to achieve their idea of justice.
And Robespierre was an anti-atheist, and he set up the cult of the Supreme Being. He hated, Diderot and de Holbach and Helvetius.
Religion is always useful to keep people in their place. And that is an idea that also has very strong connections with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who people thought of as a great sort of liberation thinker, but actually was, again, a very intellectually rich figure, a beautiful stylist, but a deeply, deeply troubled man. And someone who was in many ways very ambivalent, what he said and what he believed, but someone who definitely in his Contrat Social, the social contract, basically wrote a blueprint for Stalinism. And with all the rhetoric of beauty and love. But he believed that we have to live according to nature and to our innate goodness, and because so many people have forgotten what that is, you need a wise prince, a wise legislator who still knows that and who can legislate according to that. And people who are perverse enough to disagree with him, they have to be exiled or executed. And there has to be a secret police, and there have to be spies, and there has to be coercion and suppression in order to achieve that paradise. And that is a path that many 20th century dictators have happily taken. So,
but aside from Rousseau, there are people that try to blame like even Nazism on the Enlightenment, which is insane because the Enlightenment generally was about cosmopolitanism and about they were generally against the war. Like Immanuel Kant has his perpetual peace. He wasn't even really radical Enlightenment. So that's insane. I mean, that's more like blood and soil type of ideology, right?
Cardboard cutout thinking. That's very one-dimensional thinking. Of course, there are traditions that go from certain 18th century thinkers to 20th century totalitarianism, as there are going to 20th and 21st century, I don't know, environmentalism or left-wing thinking also. But you can't blame people in the 17th or 18th century for how people 200 later would misunderstand their ideas or manipulate their ideas. That is, that is
generally
really simplistic.
Yeah. Well, in the Enlightenment journal, you find individualism and cosmopolitanism and the idea of human potential. Uh, so that doesn't map onto Nazism at all. That's very much a blood and soil romantic thing. I mean, these guys, none of them were nationalists, I don't think, in the Enlightenment. They all kind of had a world, a global perspective, more or less. So yeah, that's an extreme perversion, I think, of history.
It is. Look, it is a perversion. It is simply, retrospective history, and judging historical figures by the values we espouse today, and blaming them for not thinking exactly as we do today. That is a rather too simplistic view of history, and I don't think we really need to lose too much time over that. But
to me, the products of the Enlightenment are like the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights. Uh, that couldn't have really started with like an invocation to Jesus, right? It had to appeal to to humanity on an equal scale, to their common humanity. And the American Revolution and the start of the French Revolution, these were all about democracy and rights but more or less an egalitarian kind of view of things. So that's really the main legacy of the Enlightenment.
These things are very much historically contingent, and yes, the American Revolution was all about individualism and equal rights, but at the same time, it's based on a genocide and on a of a crime of enormous proportions, namely on the killing of Native Americans in their tens of thousands and on slavery. Right. And, we know that Washington didn't have too much problem with keeping slaves himself, and nobody really cared about how many Native Americans were killed and in which way. Right. That was simply, the pioneer spirit, and that was also jolly profitable. So, yes, there were very strong Enlightenment ideas, and these ideas, I hope, still inform the American project. Although at the moment you see that it's wobbling quite dramatically, and you see the streets of America where, armed policemen are basically behaving like an occupation army. You see how that program can derail, how that great project can be derailed, and you can draw a very quick line to dictatorship from those scenes. Let us hope that it doesn't get that far, but, things are never quite that simple.
like I went to the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., and I spent hours there because it's like it's all his quotes are beautiful quotes, Enlightenment quotes are laid out there and they're beautiful. But yet at the same time, he couldn't get rid of his slaves. So we have that kind of contradiction there, and he was even one of the first people to try to pass legislation against slavery, but you know, still couldn't find a way to free his slaves. So yeah, we have those contradictions,
And
definitely.
when slaves were freed, what we have today, or what you have today in the American penal system, was immediately set up because you couldn't keep slaves, but you could basically the prison system could rent out people for forced labor, and so
Right,
black people, former slaves, were given disproportionately harsh sentences, and then
right,
basically sold back into slavery to their former owners.
right.
Um, so all
Well,
of
there's
these
so
stories
getting into the
also exist.
right. Well, getting into the radical enlightenment. I'm sure you know who Richard Dawkins is.
Certainly do.
So in his book, The God Delusion, he seems to not have studied history very much, and I'm a fan of Dawkins. I met him at one of his conferences, but so he mentions Diderot, and he refers to him as a deist. But
Well,
he was in he started out a deist, but he was I mean, and pretty much every Enlightenment scholar you want to look up refers to Diderot as an atheist, and it's pretty clear he was an atheist. Um, but so Dawkins didn't seem to know that Diderot talked about evolution, like in several of his works. So Dawkins wrote a book about atheism and evolution, and he mentioned Diderot and didn't know that Diderot was an atheist before Darwin, and that he talked about evolution before Darwin. And Dawkins also said, I couldn't imagine being an atheist before Darwin.
indeed.
But it's like people had these ideas of evolution way before Darwin, and they were atheists before Darwin. I wrote a blog about this, but it was fascinating when I started learning about Diderot and the Holbach, and I've really, since I started studying them, found them to be some of my intellectual heroes, and a lot of what they wrote.
Well,
So go
there
ahead and
were
talk about that.
there were heroes. I mean, first of all, to Diderot, the deist, and Dawkins. Look, Richard Dawkins is a scientist, not an historian,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
if when you write something like that, it would be good to do a bit more due diligence before. And yes, Diderot started out as a young man as a deist, but he was a man of one of the things I admire most about him is that he did what we are really challenged to do when we do any philosophy, namely to follow your thoughts, to follow good thoughts. I mean, not morally good thoughts, but consequential thoughts, good lines of reasoning, where they lead you and not where you want them to go.
right.
To follow them where they lead you, regardless of whether you want to end up there or not. And Diderot started out as a deist, but then he became fascinated by science. And the more he learned about science and about what was then known about the universe and about human life, and also about morality, how can a good God torture people in eternity, and how can he not let on about the truth of his gospel and therefore condemn most of people on the earth to everlasting punishment? And these questions he studied out. He set out at a Jesuit school to study theology, and he wanted to become a priest even originally. Um,
Yeah.
but these questions just simply no longer make sense to him. And though his first book is still, in vague sense, a deist book, he very,
The
very,
philosophical thoughts.
yes,
Yeah.
but he very quickly moved away from that. But of course, that meant that he could no longer publish that.
All right.
And so what he did was, first of all, and that is a problem with Diderot the philosopher, which is also why Diderot is still not regarded as a philosopher, really. He's regarded as the author of a few interesting novels. And as
Yeah,
the
I remember
great
looking through like Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy and books like that are really great, but they don't mention Diderot like at all. And a
but
lot of people in the French
that wasn't
Enlightenment.
known. That wasn't known back then. I mean, for instance, one of the strategies that he used, he wrote a lot of the things in letters to friends. Now, they're not considered philosophical works, so people didn't look there. He
Right,
wrote a lot of these things coded in his novels, put them into the mouths of his characters. Again, that's not where you look for systematic philosophy. But he also wrote a lot of this stuff anonymously. So There is a great work, also another much underrated work, because it's really the first systematic work against slavery and against colonialism that came out of that time, by a man called Guillaume de Rênal. It's called the Histoire de deux Indes, so actually the sort of investigation of the two Indies. And what it was basically an economic analysis of world trade in the 18th century. But it is also a flaming polemic against slavery and colonialism, and because of the idea that, who are you to think that you are more important than other people, that you have more rights to rule them than they have to rule you?
Right.
Which Diderot, for instance, also writes very movingly, puts into the mouth of a Tahitian chieftain who says,
The letter, the supplement to
to the
Wigginsville, how do you say his name?
journey, yes.
Yeah, he had traveled around the world, and Diderot had this fictional dialogue. Yeah, yeah,
And
I've read it. It's good.
that these are beautiful polemics where this old man, this old chieftain in Tahiti,
Right.
and these Europeans come, and he says, really, we should kill you all now, because that man with a piece of iron by his side, he means a soldier with a sword, and that man with a piece of wood on his side, a priest with his cross, they will enslave us and subjugate us if we let them go again back to their country. They will come back with more people and more ships. So he basically says what would indeed happen. But he says, we're not people who do that. But, you come here and say, this is now part of France. What would you say if we came with our boats and went to your shore and put up a little sign saying, this is now part of the people of Tahiti? And so, he has a very strong polemic. But Diderot wrote in this other book, the Histoire de deux Indes, Rênal had written this book, and it's a very serious piece of scholarship, and he gave it to Diderot and said, would you mind having a look at it as an editor? You're a good stylist, have a look at this. And Diderot said, I'll do that happily under one condition. Whatever I change, you're not allowed to change back. And Rênal was fine with that. He trusted Diderot. Diderot wrote another 700 pages into that book. And they have only been identified about 10 years ago. And they
10 years ago?
Yes.
I thought it was earlier than that.
I think it was late, let it be the late 20th century, but very recently. Okay. And these are the philosophically strongest, ethically strongest, most persuasive, most passionate passages in this book. But Diderot was forced to use subterfuges like that in order to get his thinking printed at all. But that means that in the history of philosophy, Diderot is not yet regarded as a very serious philosopher, because he had to use too many tricks to get his writing out there.
Yeah.
And
one of the things that I really loved about Diderot is I love pretty much everything about him, but his thoughts on sexuality. We call sexuality is one of our most natural and highest, even kind of spiritual passions. And I like how even in his first work, the philosophical thoughts, he praised the passions, like the passions to elevate us, but he also recognized we need reason to steer us, to useful ends. But I really love those. And I think in his article, Enjoyment in the Encyclopedia, he talked about how you people who malign pleasure, you exist because of pleasure. I think that's the thing the reason you exist. Yeah, definitely. And also, again, his evolutionary ideas way before Darwin. It wasn't even just evolution. He seemed to kind of home in on natural selection, the mechanism.
Yes, absolutely.
So in his letter on the blind, he has the blind scholar Saunderson refuting the argument from design of God, and Letter on the Blind, which he got locked up for, right? I think Voltaire wrote him a letter saying, "I really like that, work, but I don't agree with Saunderson's conclusion there." But yeah, he was talking about like if nature offers us a knot that's hard to untie, let us not call in to cut at the hand of a being who becomes a knot that's even harder to untie. And he talks about how the Indian says the world rests upon an elephant, and what does the elephant rest upon? A tortoise. What does the tortoise rest upon? And he said, just admit your ignorance, and it's circular reasoning, things like that.
There's a story about that.
Uh,
Because Stephen Hawking, in one of his lectures, apparently said, used that example and said, some people also think that the world rests on a turtle. But, if, or actually, he was asked by a woman in the audience, don't you know that the world rests on a turtle? And he said, well, madam, if that is so, what does the turtle rest on? And the woman said, but don't you realize it's turtles all the way down?
yeah, right.
But that sort of gets tricky, But Diderot was a stunningly modern thinker, in many ways an evolutionary thinker, and it is fascinating to see how he, without, of course, the benefit of scientific experiments at the time, of scientific theory, of an understanding of
He did
DNA.
some scientific investigation, didn't he?
He did.
Diderot?
He did to the extent that he could.
Right.
That's why the letter of the blind, what was interesting him there as a philosophical problem was, if you can't see, how does that change your sense of morality? How does it change your picture of the world if the visual part is not part of it? And that was inherently an atheist polemic. But again, he couldn't say that directly, but he had to dress it up as a story. But there's also, in one letter, there's a story of, a woman, and that had apparently happened in his circle of acquaintances. A woman had seduced the superior of her husband, and suddenly her husband had a much better job. And he relays that and says, how is it that for someone just lifting her skirts and for a few drops of white liquid, we go to all these ends? And then he says, well, we may think that is important, but what is important for nature is really only the preservance of the individual and the furthering of the species. And he says that,
Right.
100 years before Darwin. In another story, one of his most intricate, most amazing and cheekiest philosophical story, D'Alembert's Dream, which is really a great materialist experiment, because it was a materialist.
And in that, he talks about who knows what animals came before us, what animals will be after us, and we're kind of like, imagine the time scale. We're like nothing. We're like a flash in
You
the
also
time
have
scales.
the famous mathematician, and again, this is a setup of his story. He
Right.
worked on a big encyclopedia on
And
this.
that play's pretty hilarious too, actually.
Yes.
Pretty funny. Yeah.
He worked on this big encyclopedia, which was one of the great publishing projects of the 18th century, together with a very famous mathematician called D'Alembert. And D'Alembert, whose theorems are still used today,
It was another atheist, by the way.
was another atheist, but who was also sort of the incarnation of reason of the time. He was known as a cold man who would be very analytical about everything.
Right.
And he first materialist hypothesis is, now what happens if we take this mind, and there's of course also a polemic against Descartes, who thought minds and bodies have nothing to do with each other. They're two completely different things.
Dualism, yeah.
And he says, what happens if we take this brilliant mind and we raise the temperature of the body by just a little bit? D'Alembert gets a fever. And what happens? The mind goes completely off track. The mind, he has hallucinations, he has mad dreams, he spouts nonsense, he masturbates in front of his mistress. And
It's funny, the mistress doesn't know what he's doing. She describes like she has no idea.
He may
It's
also
pretty funny.
be a little bit coy at that moment. She's talking to his doctor. But then she asks, so already that's a materialist experiment, because it shows mind and body are not separate. They're obviously linked, because if you've got a fever, your mind does something. Your mind has.
You haven't had your cup of coffee, you're tired, and if a part of your brain is damaged corresponding to a certain function like facial recognition, then that's gone. Right.
Exactly.
I think they even had some inkling as to that the brain physiology back then, even.
Well, he cites, for instance, the case of someone who had an accident and brain damage, and his skull was open, and he says, if you poked his brain at this point, he could no longer speak, and then if you released your finger from the brain, he could happily speak. So what's going on there? But that was a hot topic at the time. But then he
Yeah.
also says, and that is amazing, the female character asks the doctor, how is it that children are like their parents but not identical to their parents?
Right.
And the doctor answers, and we're speaking in the middle of the 18th century here. The doctor says, well, I can only imagine that if a man and a woman have sex, that there is a sort of filament, a sort of string that passes from the man into the woman and gets combined with a sort of string in the woman. And in that combination, where the little knots are made, mistakes are made, which is why children are like their parents but not identical to their parents. And that's recombinant DNA.
Yeah.
And that
I
is
noticed that too. No.
simply a thought experiment at that point, of course, because you have no way of checking this in any experimental way.
Right.
But his thought experiments got him very far. But what, of course, was tortured him really was to think, now, if this is so, how can we still be moral? Why should we still be moral? If there's no God to punish us or to reward us,
Well,
what's
I
the
think going back to the encyclopedia, he had the article Natural Right, and he basically makes an argument for morality based on our common humanity. He talks about the general will, and I think that's a really good article, a really ahead of his time kind of article. What would you say about that? Just about Diderot's morality and about that article.
Well, I think not just about that article specifically, but I think his conclusion would be, even if the moral systems our parents have taught us are not real, suffering is real and joy is real. And so what multiplies suffering must be bad. And we can know that. We don't need a Bible to know what multiplies suffering. We know that
Right.
treating people harshly, being cruel to people multiplies suffering and makes them in themselves more violent and more resentful. So that was the point where his morality started, to say, well, we don't need a metaphysical port of call. We have all we need to know what it is moral in us, because we have two things, and that is basically the core of his idea about human beings. We have two things in us, and one is lust. That's very important for him, la volupté, actually orgasm. And the other one is empathy. We feel with and for other people. And he basically says you need nothing more to construct a moral universe. Every person has that lust to go into the world, not only to mate with others, but also simply to experience that lust, that fulfillment, if you want, in friendship, in relationships, in kindness, in art, in other things, but it is ultimately erotic.
Right.
And on the other hand, we have empathy. And if somebody else suffers, we ourselves feel worse. And you
We
don't.
feel bad if we do something, bad. So I have a book that I published called A Justified Faith. You can find it on Amazon, and I think I'm arguing along the lines of Diderot, talking about that, we're an interconnected, so no man is an island. We need other people, and we all have an innate empathy. The cooperation is beneficial. A society that's deceitful and traitorous and unreliable is not beneficial. The same for an individual. You know, and you put it in your book here, Company, which again, excellent book. You put it, you say, Diderot and de Holbach argued how desire itself is a natural spring of cooperation, that shared needs bind people together, and that empathy makes them help one another. So that's really the foundation of morality. I
It's
feel
all
bad when I treat another poorly, and they may treat me poorly too if I treat them poorly. So Yeah.
Well, then you come to enlightened self-interest, which is always a good
Yeah.
point to start.
Yeah.
To start any kind of political process or political movement, because it is a very reliable motivation. But it's not a
And
bad motivation.
with religion, you have all these tribal, you know, sects that contradict each other and can't agree, and they can't be justified to anybody outside of their sect rationally, right? But this kind of morality is universal, is based on our common foundations, our common humanity, uh, that
But
everybody shares. So
it has, of course, one drawback, which is that it never allows you to feel, I know the truth.
yeah,
Uh, it is always contingent, because what is my fulfillment? What is your fulfillment? What is my idea of suffering and what is yours? Um, it is always something that we need to keep talking about, that we need to negotiate. It is always something that is reliant on scientific insight as well as personal insight. It is something that will develop and change. And that is something that is kind of difficult to live with. Not having the one truth, so that you can say, I have the truth, therefore you don't have the truth, therefore I
well,
don't
there are
have
certain things, right? Like it's never going to be like good to go cut people's heads off. I mean, that's never going to be good for somebody to have your head cut off, because we're physical beings in a physical universe, and you know, touching a hot stove, why is that wrong? Well, you find out when you touch it. It's not
But
gonna,
at the same point, at the same time, Diderot, for instance, argues very daringly at the time, um, right and justice reside with the people, not with the king. And
right.
Diderot was not actually a radical Democrat. He was sort of a constitutional monarchist. And he said things that people today find scandalous, but I think that you should give some decent, some serious thoughts to. For instance, he said, the Enlightenment stops in the suburbs.
Yeah.
Behind that, people work too hard and are too uneducated.
But he
Um,
also thought that the best way to better society is to enlighten people. I heard him, I read
yes,
him, he said that also. So
of
he
course.
thought it may be very difficult, but
He saw the people of his time, and he saw 90% of them were not literate and were deeply religious, and he thought that as a political project, a constitutional monarchy under those circumstances may actually be a good thing. But the king only has power in trust from the people, and if the king abuses that, he should be killed. So Diderot, again, he was a man of the 18th century. You can't expect from a man of the 18th century to think only things that we think, wow, how wonderful today. He
right,
wrote different historical and political context that was already going enormously far in his own time, to think that the king holds his power and his justification of his power in trust from the people, and the people can withdraw it from him if he's not a good king.
right.
Um, but
Well,
he did not think a republic would work, because he didn't think that the kind of enlightened electorate was there that a republic would need. Now you can ask whether the enlightened electorate is today there that an ideal republic needs, but that's perhaps a different question.
well, I know he had qualms about the common people, but I've read that he did. He was a Democratic Republican. Jonathan Israel, again, for example, he cites he and the Holbach is kind of the head of that whole radical Enlightenment Democratic Republican movement, even if there were some details that varied. Um, so
Yes,
so
absolutely.
you
Again, look, these people wrote over a period of 40 or 50 years. They had many discussions, they had changes of heart, they wrote to different people in different contexts about different things. It's not maths. You can't draw a simple line and say, he believed that. The right solution is this. There is a cluster of things that they said
yeah,
about something, and there's some things they would have never said. He would have never been a theocrat who believed that all power comes from God and people have to bow to that. But
right.
he was also not someone who said, you know, all people are already mature enough to govern themselves. You may like that or not, but there's a sort of field of things that he thought and said about those things, and it is kind of problematic to just pick out the one or two you like best and say, well, that was his opinion.
Right. Well, moving on to the Holbach, who you can't. There's not really any excuse once people identify his authorship of like the System of Nature, for example, that he would not be included in philosophy, history of philosophy books, because that is, first of all, that's like the first huge work of philosophical atheism, basically. That really, I mean, you can kind of see it in the ancient world, I think, in classical antiquity a little bit. But really, that, I mean, this was way before Darwin, and it again had evolutionary ideas in it. Um, it basically he said people that imagine entities as above or apart from nature, all they ever do is they take what they experience within nature and they project that outwardly to some spirit realm, and everything is nature. And if you appeal to nature, it can tell you what you need to know, how to flourish. So talk about that a little bit. Why the Holbach is so ignored when he was such a philosopher and wrote systematic, philosophical books, many
Well,
of them, some political.
these kind of thoughts sat badly with philosophical historians in the 19th century. That wasn't particularly what societies then wanted to hear. And that, I think, is part of his continuing marginalization in the history of philosophy. Of course, what you've just described shows that we're actually talking about a ghostly presence in the background here, or perhaps a philosophical elephant in the room, and that is, again, Spinoza, who came up with the idea that there is nothing outside of nature.
Right.
And that we are all part of nature, and everything culture produces is ultimately part of nature. Just
Right.
like a chimpanzee using tools is therefore not outside of nature. So us using smartphones we are not outside of nature. Um,
Right.
and Spinoza was so much seen as the Antichrist that even these people, who of course all had read him and understood him, couldn't quote him explicitly,
Right.
because it would just be too scandalous, and they would turn off too many readers immediately if they actually said, well, I got this idea from Spinoza. But D'Holbach was he was a little bit plodding in his thinking, but in a quite brilliant way, because he really thought things through to the end.
Reading the System of Nature, he does kind of repeat things quite a bit.
Yes,
It's a very big book, and he repeats several
that's
arguments.
to have 700 pages. It does, or 300 pages. It would probably do a very good job already.
Yeah.
But he was fantastic at thinking these things through scientifically. They also knew in scientists
And
very.
he wrote scientific articles for the encyclopedia.
He wrote
Um,
scientific articles.
Scientifically literate. Yeah.
He really put his life's work into these things, and he would have a lot of similarities with Richard Dawkins. He would not quite be as intolerant to stupidity as Richard Dawkins sometimes tends to be, where he's
Right.
sort of very openly exasperated at people saying things that he finds stupid. He was a very kind man, and he would give, I mean, for instance, when he went to his country estate and his mother-in-law would accompany him, his mother-in-law's priest would also accompany him and dine with them at the supper table, and I'm sure he had to take one or two little jibes, but he was perfectly tolerant enough to think if somebody else wants this spiritual dimension in their lives, that's fine with me.
Yeah.
What he was a fantastically consequential thinker, and he was a fantastically courageous thinker. He also tended to be, I think, a little bit simplistic when it came to human nature. D'Holbach really thought like his friend and incidentally neighbor, Claude Helvetius, who was another one of these writers, of these atheist materialist writers. He thought that people are immoral and people are behaving perversely because they're living in a perverse society in which They are taught lies about God, in which they are taught lies about the political structure and that oppression is normal and that brutality is normal. And if we take that away, if we take away the perverseness, then people will no longer be perverse. They will be good and virtuous. And, that sets you up for disappointment, that hypothesis, because people are complicated. And as Diderot says somewhere else, replying to a different author, he says, do you really think if you give me 10,000 children to educate, and I give them the best and kindest education, I will have 10,000 morally virtuous little geniuses? No. People are tall and short, and they're brutal and gentle, and they're clever and stupid, and they're impulsive and reflective, and you have to make a society out of that. You have to make a society, yes, remove the perversity, but do not expect that everybody will then be magically virtuous. And yet is Diderot the evolutionary thinker. There's Diderot the thinker that thinks, well, in the recombination of these two things, that mistakes may be introduced. No, we are not ideal people, and therefore society will never be ideal. And if you try to make society ideal, you're going to be disappointed, and you're going to at some point become
But we're risen apes, basically. We're not fallen angels. So we're animals, and we all with all that comes with. But we have the ability to reason and there are objective measures of well-being that we can, if you value well-being, which really that's kind of the starting point. Most people prefer to be happy and not, suicidally depressed. Most people want to be healthy and not sick. I mean, these are basic commonalities, and they're kind of are good ways to navigate that landscape in really demonstrably bad ways. Uh, so, and we can learn from history, things like that, definitely, and rely on the science that tells us when maybe one of our intuitions is not as fallacious. Um, but one other thing about the Holbach, his political writing seems to me very Democratic Republican, very as all the Radical Enlightenment, very, universal rights, things like that.
He was very much more, as I say, he was very much more a clear-cut thinker than Diderot was.
Yeah.
Diderot always saw in himself, as much as in other people, the contradictory aspects, the things that he could not reconcile. In his own thinking, for instance, he was the greatest atheist of the 18th century, but he always retained a sentimental attachment to religion. There are tales of when he was an old man and a religious procession would pass by his window, tears would well up in his eyes, because he missed that security in his childhood, and he'd been a child of profoundly religious parents who were also profoundly decent and good people. And he could not have access to that strong and direct morality that takes away all questions for you and that gives you all the answers at once. I think that's quite important. I think that he recognizes himself that longing for a greater meaning, while also recognizing that that greater meaning can never be had. That makes him psychologically a much more interesting thinker.
But I think he realized that plenty of meaning was to be found, the meaning that humans create. You create your own meaning. It's not lying under a rock. And everything in reality is full of, the universe is full of mysteries and the adventure of exploring them and finding things out and progress and bettering humanity and all of that and all the richness of reality of the human condition, love, friendship, sex, adventure, learning. I think Diderot really he found fulfillment in all of that. I mean, to me is pretty evident in his writings.
Friendship. He turned art critic later in his career because he thought art could fill some of that longing for meaning. And art is ultimately, giving meaning, giving form, giving structure to something structureless and unformed. Whether it's telling a story, which only picks up the things that are important, gives them a beginning and a meaning and an end in a moral universe, or whether it's a painting, as he described it. So he sought ways of satisfying that hunger for meaning that he had, that he recognized in himself. And I think that is actually profoundly modern thought. because even if we realize that religion is composed mainly of falsehoods or even of lies, religion does play a very important role in the lives of many people because it gives them that access to, it satisfies that longing for meaning and morality. And if you discount that for yourself because you recognize it as false, that doesn't mean that that longing goes away. And you need to give that longing something to feed it. And Diderot sought that in art, and he found that in art also to some degree. That was
But
the most
I
important
think,
thing. Also in friendship and also in love, and indeed erotic love. I mean, he had a
right.
mistress for 30 years, and this is interesting. Diderot always sought out the company of profoundly intellectual women, strong women, women who
Is
spoke
there a
their own
book where
mind.
I could get his letters with Sophie Voland? I've been trying to find a book because I've heard those letters are really, rich.
You
I
must
can't
read
find it.
You must read them. I'm not sure whether it's a full English translation. Again, because Diderot has been treated so badly by posterity, which is hugely ironic because
Not
that
as
was
not as bad as the whole box. I still knew about Diderot years and years and years ago before I really started studying. I didn't know about the whole box.
philosopher,
So
but not
yeah,
about Diderot the philosopher, probably. But
yeah.
he's been treated so badly by posterity that many of his works aren't translated yet into English, or at least not adequately. These letters to Sophie Volant are a total joy. They are playful, they are cheeky, they are erotic, they are philosophical, they are chatty, they contain lots of gossip, they contain fantastically profound thoughts, all sort of mingled together from one
Right.
sentence to the next. They give you a wonderful image of life at the time. The thing is, and you might be when you hear that she wasn't actually called Sophie but Henriette,
Right.
and that only his voice, only the male voice is speaking, the female voice is completely silent, you may be, you might have a sort of feminist knee-jerk reaction and say, well, this is just typical. Actually, it's sort of the opposite because Diderot's daughter, Diderot educated his daughter like a boy. He gave her lessons in mathematics and geometry. He gave her the best music teachers. He wrote to contemporary composers to get new pieces for her to play. When she got into puberty, he had a midwife come and show her anatomical models of what was happening to her body and how she would become a mother, etc. So he was as progressive a father as you can, but he was also a child of his time. So he was still trying to pick a husband for her. So,
Yeah.
again, contradiction. But this woman, who became a very happy woman and married a very conventional man, led a very conventional life, she was quite embarrassed by these letters. So all the letters that Sophie Volant had written to her lover, Diderot, she had in her possession, of course, because she was Diderot's daughter, and she burned them all.
Right.
So it was a woman who erased the woman's voice in this dialogue, and that's why we've only got Diderot's letters, who was said to the Volant family.
Well, Diderot said on a very kind of muddled little thing he wrote called On Women that he thinks women's genius is greater than men's, basically. Uh,
Yes, and
yeah.
he also and one of his friends says, if women are less educated and have a reputation for being somehow flippant and insincere, then look at how they get educated. Look at what we teach them. Look at what we reward them for, the girls.
And pretty much the whole Radical Enlightenment had kind of this similar views on prejudice against everybody, really, but women included.
They were
Yeah.
really ready to rethink the world
Yeah.
very, very fundamentally, and also in ways that weren't necessarily in their own interest, and that weren't in their material interest, that weren't in their interest of their social standing. And I think that's what makes them what makes them important, and also that's what makes them still very modern. In many ways, when you read them, in their
Yeah.
moral ideas, in their
I
ideas
see
of
so many arguments that writers now make that they made way back, way back then. So
let me
yeah,
read
definitely.
to cap off things. Let me read you one passage, or maybe you have it there. Well, you do have it there because you
I
have the book
do
in front.
have it, but I probably have it, but it's in the other room, so
Let
I
me,
would have to.
let
Yeah.
me just I have to read you this because it is it is sort of the embodiment of everything that I said. Sorry that I had to leave you for a moment, but
Read from your book.
yes, well, I'm going to read from Diderot as relayed in this book, but I do have to find it, and you may
That's
want
fine.
this. You
Yeah,
may
I'd really love to learn French. I speak Spanish, so I'm bilingual. I've lived in Central America, but I've
listen.
noticed a lot of
Well,
they
you
have
wouldn't
common
quote.
origin,
I
the
found
romantic languages. Yeah.
Diderot here as an art critic talks about what art could be like if it hadn't been put totally in the service of Christianity and of the values that Christianity inculcated, which is, rather anti-sex, rather anti-joy, rather anti-beauty or anti-physical.
That's obsessed with sexuality. Absolutely.
And so he writes this, I think, and just imagine you would read this in the New York Times today. If the angel Gabriel had been praised for his beautiful shoulders, if Magdalene had had a gallant adventure with Christ, if at the wedding of Cana Christ had, between two wines, a little unconventionally, let his hand stray over the neck of one of the maids of honor, or the buttocks of St. John, unsure of whether he would remain faithful to the apostle whose chin was already shadowed by a light feathery beard, you would see what would matter to our painters, to our poets and our sculptors, in which tone we would speak of these charms, which would play such a great and marvelous role in the history of religion of our God, and how we would look at the beauty to which we owe our birth, the incarnation of our Savior, and the grace of our redemption.
Good
And
quote.
that is powerful stuff, and it's powerful stuff at the beginning of the 21st century, never mind in the middle of the 18th.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Blum, I did want to ask you about La Mettrie briefly. Can you kind of tell us about La Mettrie, kind of briefly, like why he was important
Yes,
and what he thought?
willingly, very brief thumbnail sketch. Entertainingly, Julien Onfray de La Mettrie was a hardcore materialist philosopher, and Diderot couldn't stand him.
He was another atheist, right? But he really didn't. He
Yes.
had a really vacuous or empty, or he was basically amoral.
Well, and that
Uh,
was why Diderot hated no one more than La Mettrie, although he agreed on almost everything with him. Why? Because La Mettrie wrote one book that is called L'Homme Machine, Man a Machine, in which he says, translated into modern terms, we're just biological robots. Morality is an illusion. We are here to procreate. We're here to have sex. We're here to have fun. And if that doesn't go well, well, too bad. But there is no meaning. There is no morality. There is no good and there is no bad. And that was a step too far for Diderot, because Diderot, as I said, materialist that he was, he wanted to create a moral world. He wanted to create a world in which people could live a good life. And he could not accept that someone would go to this length and say there is no such thing and just enjoy yourself, which is already a step to this sort of, if you want, this sort of negative imprint of the Enlightenment, namely the Marquis de Sade, which then basically says only, my enjoyment stands above everything else. And if my enjoyment destroys other people's lives, well, that's just their bad luck. And so La Mettrie was a very important voice at the time, because he was so daring, he went so far. But Diderot took the greatest pleasure in the way La Mettrie died, which was indeed, was fantastic, because La Mettrie was invited by Frederick the Great of Prussia. Basically, Frederick just wanted to needle his courtiers, who were a provincial and conservative bunch. And so he got this, Frederick himself was gay and he didn't think much of conventional morality in any way. And so he got this outrageous Frenchman over to Potsdam, near Berlin, to sort of, really go put the cat among the pigeons there at court. And La Mettrie was there, and he choked on a pastry.
Right.
And so he, this idea that this
I've
man
heard he might have been poisoned, food poison.
may have been, but but it was of course just irresistible that this man who was the prophet of total immoral or amoral pleasure would die through his own gluttony. So Diderot took great pleasure in that, but that's really detail, because one can only admire these radical thinkers, and I tell you why I admire them most. Not only because they think many things that I happen to have learned through them, and that is in itself admirable, but because they dared to think things that nobody else at the time thought, that not even people they respected and looked up to would respect and accept, but that their own thinking had led them to. And that kind of intellectual daring, that is absolutely invaluable in any kind of ideological context. Because, whatever environment you're in, there are ideas that are basically received ideas. They're no longer questioned. Whether you stand on the right or the left politically, whether you're an atheist or you're religious, you live in an environment where certain ideas mustn't be discussed, can't be discussed, won't be discussed. And to have the courage to say, well, I've thought about this and I haven't yet found a better argument. Give me a better argument. But if I haven't found one and I can't accept that, then I have to stick with that.
That reminds me of a work in 1713 called A Discourse on Free Thinking by, I think it was Anthony Collins, who was a British author. But basically, if you just take received ideas from your grandma, basically, you can only be right by accident. But if you investigate things, you can really, consciously, for good reasons and evidence.
You asked me at the beginning of this conversation, what's the essence of the Enlightenment? That's the essence of the Enlightenment. The essence of the Enlightenment is to take a logical train of thought, and as long as you don't make any fault in the argument, as long as every link links up with every other, you need to accept where you end up. Not because you like it, not because it flatters you or it speaks to your prejudices, but because it's a good chain of argument.
Right. Well, in closing, Mr. Blom, why do you think the Enlightenment is not more well known? Like, everybody knows what the Renaissance is. When you tell them what the Renaissance is, they know about it. But the Enlightenment, they think it's something to do with Buddhism. But the Enlightenment is extremely important. It's where we get so much of our modern institutions and ideals, our secular democracies, things of that nature. So, there's hardly any documentaries. I saw you in one, Heroes of the Enlightenment, that I think was made some years ago. But there's not many. So why is that?
Well, I think that maybe a phenomenon that's more strong in the US than it is in Europe.
So,
If you talk about the Enlightenment, people think of the Enlightenment. They don't think of Buddhism. But I think religion still plays quite a strong role in the United States.
That's what I was thinking. Because the Enlightenment is so anti-religious. Maybe that has something to do with it.
In many parts, very anti-religious. And, the founding fathers were, some of them, like Jefferson, were very strong enlightened thinkers. Benjamin Franklin. Also quite daring enlightened thinkers in many ways. Others were not so interested in philosophy, frankly. They were more interested in politics.
But there's no doubt that the Enlightenment, that like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are Enlightenment documents. They were inspired by Montesquieu. They were inspired by all kinds of Enlightenment ideas.
But, I do think that it is still true that we all want to believe what we want to believe. Feeling is easy, thinking is hard.
Right. Yeah.
And, we know from electoral research, which has been particularly finely grained in the United States, how deeply embedded we are in our social environments. And that if you give me your postcode, and not only because I see it behind you, but if you gave me your postcode and your ethnic group and something like that, I could tell you what car you drive, what first names your children have, what paintings you have on your wall, what books you read, if any. But
All right.
which means freedom of will and freedom of judgment may not be all it's cracked up to be. To sheer away from that, to try to go your own path, is something that is hard. It is something that makes you lose friends. It is something, yeah, it also makes you gain new friends, by the way. But, and I think, especially in a polarized society, in which your own tribe is so important, and in which religion still plays a relatively important role, that's not a great setting, not a great context to develop these ideas and to really play with them. So I think that may have something to do with the fact why in America, particularly, I think, the Enlightenment in the historical 17th, 18th century sense is still not so much present in the public eye.
Yeah, it's a shame. The nuns are the fastest growing demographic in America. It's like I think 25% now, but you don't even have to be a nun to be a non-religious person to appreciate the Enlightenment, and freedom and equality and all of that. And the principle of secularism, that we want to allow all people to believe what they want to believe as long as they don't infringe on the rights of others. And we don't want a single religion to control the government because that's all of history shows that's a recipe for bloodshed. Um, so yeah, definitely. Well, Mr. Blom, thank you so much for being with me today. And I have it as a goal to get over to Paris and some other surrounding areas to visit Holbach Salon, I believe, is still standing.
Still standing. I was in
Yeah.
there. I was in there. There was a pot plant in there and two financial advisors, which I thought was a sign of the times. They had no idea the room in which they were sitting had been inhabited by some of the most brilliant people of the 18th century.
All
Uh,
right.
so you need to be careful also to which address you go. But it's absolutely worth seeing.
Yeah.
And well, come over to Europe, have a look.
Absolutely. I plan to. And there are actually statues of Diderot. I think in his hometown of Lagrange
Oh, there's a
and
statue.
in Paris.
Also in Paris, there's a statue,
Yeah.
quite a nice one. He's sort of thoughtfully sitting there,
Yeah.
looking to the future.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Well, again, Mr. Blom, thank you so much for being with me
Thank
today. I really enjoyed it. This is an extremely important
you.
topic, and it's a favorite one of mine. So, all right, thank you so much.
Okay.